can you please introduce yourself when you take the floor? And Kat, if there are questions from our online audience, please let me know. Dr. Khalid, do we have a roaming microphone somewhere?
Thank you very much. I am Khalid Al-Mubarak. I'm the media counselor of the Embassy of Sudan in London. I thought this was thank you very much for the presentation of a very impressive and well-researched and balanced report. I mean, really, very impressive the way you presented it and the way you were critical about certain things, but also in a manner which is not very partial, which is not very aggressive, or which is not very unacceptable to any listener or organization. The big question, of course, is that this is a report written about a transitional period, meaning that it's written under the shadow of conflict, which means that everything, including the speculation about recommendations, is bound to be impacted by this. So that questions like will the IDPs return or not return, which Mr. Khidir has touched upon, will also, of course, have to be revisited once the situation changes, because maybe other factors will have to be considered then. That's why I think that one of the matters which could be thought of now in the light of this report is when peace is finally signed, and there are now very encouraging news from Doha. We have heard encouraging news in the past and we were disappointed, but let us hope this time will not be disappointed. So if this happens, a lot of money is being allocated, reportedly at least $2 billion for reconstruction of Darfur. So where would you think such money should be best allocated? Because as far as the human factor is concerned, Darfur is much more prepared than the South to reconstruct, because Darfur had a long history of governance as a sultanate for centuries, and the population have got the idea of government, of dealing with government, and so reconnecting again and helping and being part of the reconstruction project will not be very difficult. And two small questions. Some things were published about a young woman, an entrepreneur, who succeeded in the building industry. Have you come across her in any way? And then the other one is there was about the threat to the environment. There was a UNESCO and United Nations project of ovens which use sunshine in order to reduce the lack of firewood. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jill.
My name's Jill Lusk and I'm a journalist. As someone who lived in Nyala in 1975, I'd like to add a note on the building industry. It used to be very common then for women to work in the building industry, but I don't think the current Khartoum government would approve of them because they used to work stripped to the waist on the building sites. I'd ask a question about de-urbanisation if I can. You've talked a lot about Nyala growing. I was wondering if it shrunk at all. And if there's any way of measuring that, either IDPs going home voluntarily or otherwise to their areas, or people moving to other parts of Sudan, as they did, of course, most obviously in the south, for work and for security. Thank you.
Thanks. Is there anybody else, or we'll go back to the panel? Please.
Just ask one question about the My name is Sue Phillips from Social Development Direct. I wanted to ask two short questions, really. One, I was interested in the research being commissioned by DFID, so I was interested in knowing what DFID's purpose was in commissioning the research. And secondly, I think sort of linked to that, or I hope linked to that, is the thinking more about the role of international agencies. To what extent in Sudan, I don't personally know Sudan, I know quite a lot about urbanisation, but not this country context. So where is the government in terms of its sort of perception of urbanisation and development of an urban policy? Because this has clearly been a big issue in other countries that are more urbanised. I guess my most recent experience in Bangladesh, which has a massive urbanisation problem, but the government still subscribes to the myth that Bangladesh is a rural economy and it has virtually no urban policy. So I'd be very interested to know the context here.
Thank you very much.
Yahya al-Bashir, SLM. Thank you about the report. My mainly concerns is the humanitarian policies regarding urbanizations. It's really connected with the central government policies. And the central government policies in terms of the security issues in Darfur, it's obviously clear. They expelling NGOs, and also they denying accessing of the UNIMIT for the protection of the civilians, and also there is no security that for the IDPs to get back to their original areas. And also economical policies also. There is oil revenue in central government, but instead of using it for the development, they waging war for it. And also development policies also, it's carried by the central government. In Darfur, it's different from the other areas of the northern Sudan. If we see in the northern Sudan states, dams have been built, highways, and many services. So the whole issue is the issue of misidentity and misdefinitions of the Sudan since 1953 up to date. And that is what is waging war in the south and lead to the separation of the south. And that is what's waging war in the Darfur and lead to the genocide and lead also to the indictment of the president of Sudan by the International Criminal Court. So the whole picture is the way of government in the central Sudan. What do you think about that, mate?
Thank you very much. Margie, do you want to go first?
Yeah.
We'll go for another round of comments.
Well, lots of really interesting comments and questions. Let's see where to start. Maybe I'm going to finish with your question about $2 billion. What would the priorities be? Because I think that's a really interesting one, and that takes us into kind of more constructive territory of what could be done at this particular point. But so let me start off with is Nyala shrinking at all? Well, what was interesting was the central parts of Nyala. I mean, for instance, I think Hayal Wadi is one of the longest settled quarters of Nyala, and what was very interesting was how that was changing, because a lot of better off households are choosing to leave Darfur. Choosing to leave Nyala, usually to go to central Sudan. So there was a real concern amongst some of the long-term residents of Hayal Wadi about how the nature of that quarter, for example, was changing. But I mean, that's on a small scale compared with this huge influx of people coming into Nyala because they're displaced, because there is no longer trading opportunities out in the rural areas for all sorts of reasons. So overall, the expansion is very clear. And then I just want to pick up on actually what the discussants both talked about. What are the IDPs? What are their intentions? What are they going to do? And I think there is this real problem that we haven't had an IDP intentions survey yet. And that would really be enlightening, because we're all to some extent we're all speculating, and we're all, you know, we're basing it on focus group discussions that we have in doing other pieces of work. So we are all speculating, but I think there is an awful lot that can be learned from elsewhere in Sudan, particularly after the signing of the CPA. And in fact, ODI was involved in a study on return and reintegration after the signing of the CPA, which I was, again, fortunate to be part of. And I found it so fascinating being part of that, because I just kept thinking, there's so much learning in places like Southern Kordofan about how people have responded to a peace agreement and to some security being re-established. There's so much learning from that in terms of what people are likely to do in Darfur. And the splitting of households that Suzanne mentioned was very common. So some family members staying in the town and some going back to maintain their land rights, to continue some kind of farming. But I think it's the fact that some members, even if the entire household doesn't stay in the town, the fact that some members of the household stay in the town, particularly the younger ones, particularly the ones who are going through education, that was a very strong pattern post-CPA. DFID's purpose in conducting this study, I think that there was you could say it was an overdue, but it was a really important awareness of the growing issue of urban poverty, and an awareness on the part of DFID as a donor, but also in consultation with other donors, of we need to be paying attention, we need to understand this, we need to be paying attention to this, and we need to do some kind of analysis so we know how to respond to it. And a particular interest, I think, also in the Darfur case, because of its links with conflict as well. But as Zara said, we're planning some dissemination events in Sudan and in Nyala in March, which I think is going to be a great opportunity for some of these dialogues that we keep talking about that need to happen between the international community and government. It's a real opportunity for that to start, or to continue where it has started. And I just want to pick up on the you know, with the kinds of funding that would be available to Darfur, you know, when peace is established. And I mean, of course, there's going to be so many competing priorities, but I think that investment in infrastructure is going to be absolutely key, and that's, you know, urban infrastructure, it's transport infrastructure, it's communications infrastructure, it's infrastructure that's really going to enable Darfur to develop its full potential. And I found it, but I think I've lost it again. Anyway, somewhere in this report, there's a quote from, it was actually somebody from the Chamber of Commerce in Nyala. We spent quite a bit of time talking to them for obvious reasons. And you know, they were saying South Darfur should be one of the richest states in Sudan. So the potential is there, and it's what investment is needed to develop that potential, how to really develop the private sector. Trade is going to be an absolutely key engine of growth for Darfur's future, for its economic recovery. But at the same time, you know, let's not forget about the investment that will need to happen to enable people to recover their livelihoods. So there's the sort of high-level economic investment that's needed, and investment in infrastructure, but then there's also support to individual households so that they can recover their livelihoods. And again, I think there's a lot of learning from the return and reintegration study about things that easily get overlooked. Sometimes it's easiest just to I don't know, put in a new water point or something without looking at the wider social dynamics of how do you, where people do want to return home, how do you support reintegration? That's not just going to happen without some kind of support. So I think there's a lot of learning from the last 6 years in other parts of Sudan that could be applied to Darfur. And then very, very finally, if Zara wasn't losing her voice, I'd toss some of these questions back at her, but I'll take pity on you. Because the other question about government's policy on urbanisation, well, Zara and I both participated in a conference in, I think it was November, in Khartoum, which was facilitated by UN Habitat with the government on the issue of urbanisation. And so I think there is an engagement with the whole issue of urbanisation. And I think the important thing is to make sure that it isn't just a discussion that's happening between urban planners, but actually it's looking at issues of poverty, it's looking at issues of the urban economy, and it's looking at some of the social dynamics as well. So let me pause at that point.
Perhaps I could just add that the Khartoum case study was carried out under the auspices of the National Council for Strategic Planning in Sudan. They facilitated the contact with Khartoum state governor and the various state ministries. And I think that's an important indication of the importance that the government has attached to the study, the importance it recognizes to the issue of urbanization, so much so that the central institution for planning has supported the study.
And in Darfur, just to add, in Nyala, we were working very closely with the Ministry of Physical Planning and Public Utilities. So again, there was a real willingness to engage with the work in Nyala as well.
Al-Kidi and Susan, do you want to pick up on some of the questions and add your comments?
No, I want to stress on the point that within the trend and increasing in urbanization in Sudan, I always felt that, or any place, as I said, I always felt that if you are missing the why people are coming to urban, what are the reasons, and those reasons are not addressed part of a comprehensive plan, then the administration in any city or a town, they will not be able to cope with the challenges in that city. And I think that is what I felt we are missing in Sudan. We don't look at things in a comprehensive way. For example, I read the government strategy for Darfur. It doesn't define the issue. It talks about the symptoms. It touches the symptoms. Instead of trying to address, these are the real issues, and therefore this is a plan to address the real issues. But when you make your plan to address the symptoms, still the root causes will be there, and you'll find yourself is just firefighting, and that is the challenge I see right now.
Thanks, Kiri. Susan, you're welcome.
I think
no. Is there a question from the online audience?
Yeah, we have a question from Ellen Nicol, and this is directed to Marky and El Khidir. Looking forward, how might the process of urbanization and development in Nyala be influenced by an emerging separate state to the south, in terms of trade, movement of people, livestock, goods, and services?
So,
can you repeat the last one?
The influence was how may it be affected?
Can you repeat it in the microphone?
Okay. Sorry, I think if I understood it rightly, with how might the future of Nyala be affected by the separation of the south?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. And before we address the question, is there any other question from the floor? Yes, a few gentlemen here.
Well, actually, my name is Saif, and I represent a group of Darfurians called Darfur Development Agenda. Just a few points here I just want to highlight on the land issue and the culture in Darfur, which will, looking into the population or the IDP population right now in Nyala or in the other cities of Darfur, I would really support the idea of Khidir that majority of people might have the idea to move back. But that being said, it is also expected that big number of the IDPs will remain in Nyala. That brings us back again to the point of the master plan that was already being put into Nyala plans, and they are looking for funds for that one. And the master plan doesn't include that big number of IDPs that might remain into Nyala. So that master plan might not be valid, at least for the time being. That being said, now I'm going to another issue of the resources. I wonder if the authorities in Nyala, as well as the central government, are not able to find the fundings for the master plan. Is it the right time for us as humanitarian workers to advocate for the donors to raise some funds for the urbanization? Especially that it's very easy to raise funds when it is a life-saving programs and emergencies, but it is always difficult to raise funds for development and urbanization. Is it time for us to do so? Thank you.
Thanks. The lady.
Thank you. My name is Gillian Nevins, and I'm a human rights consultant. I've missed the term security of tenure in this discussion. I'm thinking particularly about some work I did in Angola, where after a long civil war, a lot of IDPs settled in Luanda and other cities and just stayed there. And then as soon as development started after the war, or as the war ended, a lot of people were displaced arbitrarily to make way for development. And then there was a problem of where they went to, and there was absolutely no security of tenure. So people were displaced and then redisplaced. I think it's an important issue.
Thanks. And gentleman here and then there.
My name is Joy, and I work for the British Red Cross. My question is essentially based on livelihood activities. One of the findings is that agriculture trade has actually gone down, and Nyala has become an importer of goods. And also that agriculture sector and livestock sector has collapsed. And one of the recommendations is that we need to invest in activities such as microcredit and vocational training in urban areas. My question is there an opportunity, or what are your views of investing into sectors such as agriculture and livestock in rural areas? And will that help some of these communities either not to come back to urban areas, or an investment or incentive for them to go back to rural areas? Any views on that? Thank you.
Thanks.
Ewan Robinson from International Rescue Committee. It was mentioned that the study of urban populations had been generally neglected by international agencies and NGOs. I just wondered whether you might talk a little about the overlap and the differences in needs between IDPs in Nyala and the urban poor more generally. You mentioned that wage differentials had narrowed. I just wondered if you had any other examples of where there's been a similar trend, or where there are remaining differences which international agencies need to recognise.
There's one more online, okay.
This is from Wawa Gafar Pakhit from the University of Reading. He would like to direct two questions to the panel. How has governance institutions coped with the rapid organization? And the second question was, last time he had been to Nyala, which was in 2005, government top officials started households in Khartoum when promoted. Is that still very common, or is there more of a local link?
I didn't get the second.
Can you repeat the second
The
question?
second part. Oh no, I didn't hear the question.
In terms of the top, when last time he had been to Nyala in 2005, government officials started households in Khartoum, and he just wants to know if that's still very common, or if there is more of a local link.
Basically saying that government in Nyala actually had families in Khartoum, and there were officials coming from the center, but
so he's
in the administration in Nyala, and whether the administration has become more localized.
So he's concerned with the response of a more local level.
Yeah. Okay. If there is no other input, we'll take one last round of comments from the panel. Suzanne, do you want to go first?
Sure, sure. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last two questions at all, so I'll leave those for some of the others. Where should I start? I think maybe starting a little bit about kind of the IDP population and the question that Saif, or the point that Saif made on, you know, whether the majority will move back, some of them will remain, and, you know, should we be advocating for donors to address some of the issues of urbanization, I mean, as a humanitarian community. And, I mean, I think one of the, I mean, we've already mentioned, you know, how IDPs have got sort of members of households or members of their household in many different places, but I think also, you know, the way, what we can see already is that the way that people go back is not suddenly they're in Nyala and then they decide to go home. It is a gradual process where, you know, people might go home seasonally or, yeah, indeed leave family members there. And so in one of the that's one of the issues that I've been struggling with is how would the humanitarian community support that process? And Margie and I and others were in a meeting with WFP last October, where they were saying, well, if people go home, we take their ration card away. And I was thinking, well, actually, that is the one way of making sure that people don't even go and visit their farms anymore. So anyway, so for me, that's been one of the issues. How do we support the process of people visiting their home areas, but not necessarily be expected to stay there immediately? But at the same time, of course, it is necessary to start thinking very much about dealing with an increasingly urbanized population. And I think, you know, if you look at, I mean, I come very much from the humanitarian perspective, but if you look at some of the humanitarian indicators in terms of access to water, access to healthcare, morbidity, mortality, nutrition status, you could actually, from any perspective, whether it's humanitarian or development, advocate better services or, you know, an increased coverage of healthcare and water, or better, good water facilities in any case. And I think, you know, maybe the other point I'd like to make is that, of course, we focus on the urban population today, and it has been a relatively neglected area. But, I mean, in I think all the places where we went for this study, the rural populations are equally, if not worse off. So it is really important to remember that there are many, many issues to be addressed in the rural populations as well. And, you know, which of course influence the link between rural and urban populations. And I think that also links to the other question in terms of infrastructure in rural areas for livestock and livestock keepers. I mean, it's obvious that is one of the things that will be needed once it is safe for people to go back home. I'll leave it at that. And
thanks. Elkidi, do you want to?
Okay.
You can answer the other questions.
I'll go around three issues very quickly. One, response to a question, and two, I feel that just as an added value from this study, we should take them forward. Will the separation of South affect Nyala? I would say yes. In what sense? Three. First, there are IDPs from South Sudan. They came to Nyala. When they arrived in Nyala, they are casual laborers. Now, they are not. They are skilled laborers. Going out of that market is going to create a little bit of a gap in the labor. That's one. Secondly, there's a petty trade completely dependent on the South. Now they don't get a visa for the South. In the future, they have to get a visa. And this petty trade around honey, around handicrafts, and those people are making their livelihood by selling this in the South. And thirdly, nomadic. If the nomadic movement beyond beyond the 1956 boundaries, that may lead to rapid increase in urbanization. And I will recommend, you will see 3 cities growing or towns growing: Buram, Nyala, and Adayan. Those are the 3 cities near each other, 2 towns actually, and 1 city near each other could grow as a result of that if the livelihood in the pastoralists is not working. An issue I would love to do as a person working in the humanitarian is safety net. Now, the safety net is very much taken by transfer in kind by the relief agencies. Actually, what is the role of the Zakat fund? What is the role of these funds which support the poor? Has to be research. Finally, thirdly, in the issues of the study generally, I felt that, honestly, as a Sudanese, I feel that the fellow Sudanese must take this study because it has so many streams. About education, there's a stream. About revitalization of the private sector, there's a stream. About the identity of people who are coming to the, and then the issues of the IDPs, the issue of livelihood. There are many streams in these studies, and it cannot be solved by one ministry or cannot be solved by a government. It has to be solved by multiple stakeholders. And that multiple stakeholders, they have to have a conducive environment whereby the study is being unpacked, and then solutions is being designed.
Thank you very much, Al-Khidr. Margin, concluding thoughts?
Concluding thoughts. Al-Khidr, I think, spoke very well to this question of the likely impact of the separation of the South. I think it's all to do with how free or how what barriers may be put in place to the movements of people and trade. I think that's absolutely critical, and livestock, of course. The Nyala master plan, and sort of what can be done now and what funding could be put into it. I have to say, despite all these debates about humanitarian versus development, what's humanitarian, what's development, I tend to prefer to think of it not as, is this activity humanitarian or is this development? I don't really care about that. If something needs to be done, it should be done. I think it's about whether you follow humanitarian principles, and I think there are things that can be done to support the growth, the development of Nyala during the conflict, and it's a question of doing them in a balanced and impartial way in terms of how the international community engages. And I think, and somebody else asked, maybe you asked about the possibilities for investment in agriculture and livestock in rural areas. I think Suzanne was absolutely right to remind us of the needs in rural areas, which are sometimes more hidden, and yet the needs can be huge. But at the same time, there is investment in agriculture. I mentioned the dairy industry, I mentioned market gardening, around Nyala as well. And one of the things that we did come across is how some of the IDPs have started farming again. They're still living in the camps. Some of them are able to go back to their farms, but just on a seasonal basis. And I think that, to speculate, that may become a long-term trend where family members are left behind, but some go back to farm seasonally. But also we were seeing IDPs renting land around Nyala. That seems to be something that's happened just in the last few years, and seems to be quite an important development. So I think there are things that can be done to support agriculture. And then very finally, well, gosh, there's so many points still, but I don't think we can cover them all. Government institutions and rapid urbanisation. Let me pick that one up. I think Al-Khidr has made the really important point that there's many different ministries that have to be engaged with the kind of thinking about the future of Nyala. And one of the things we've recommended is some kind of review of urban policies in greater depth than we were able to do in this study, because we were also concerned that there's sometimes quite confusing and overlapping roles and responsibilities between different ministries and different institutions, particularly between the Nyala Municipality Office and between, for instance, the Ministry of Finance, which are both competing to raise revenues. And the consequence of that can be this sort of strangling tax regime. So I think some of that does need to be looked at very carefully, and a really clear kind of direction and roadmap, which would involve some quite substantial updating of the Nyala master plan, so that there really is some kind of dialogue, even amongst government ministries about the future of Nyala, but hopefully that might involve the international community as well.
Thank you so much, Margie. Thank you to all of you for stimulating, what I think has been a very engaging discussion today. I look forward to welcoming you all to our third meeting on the Port Sudan study, and to welcoming our online audience as well. We will announce the date, hopefully next week. We're finding it difficult to find a date for all the panelists to be in the same room, but we're getting there, hopefully. But in the meantime, I'm sure you'll agree we've had a fantastic panel, and please join me in thanking them for great discussion today.